A suspension of mercy. (24) Of the two problems, Alicia and Alex, Alicia seemed the bigger. When Sidney tried to think about Alex, Alicia intruded and forced Sidney to think about something he had always shrugged off, taken for granted, and tried not to think about. That was the relationship between Alicia and himself. He had been loyal to Alicia during the year and 10 months of their marriage. Because he had not thought about it before, Sidney did not know if he had been loyal because he really loved Alicia, because there had been no temptation, or because he was naturally loyal. Sidney had always supposed natural loyalty was an attribute more of women than of men. He had seen lots of pretty girls, even met them at parties, and had thought briefly of how it would be to go to bed with a few of them, but it had never crossed his mind to make any efforts in that direction. He had even said to Alicia a few times, "Gosh, isn't so-and-so a knockout?" And Alicia hadn't been jealous, and Sidney hadn't expected her to be. Alicia had said now and then, "Don't you think so-and-so's attractive? He's what I'd call my type, if I had a type." And she'd smile at Sidney, and that had always been the end of it. Sidney had taken it for granted Alicia was loyal because she was very conventional, really, and had been rather primly brought up. Women like her just didn't have extramarital affairs, he thought, unless something went awfully wrong with their marriage, or with them. Since Alicia seemed fairly all right in the head, though a bit neurotic, Sidney had to conclude something had gone horribly wrong with their marriage. They had certainly used to make love more often than they had in the past 6 months, but that was, of course, a result, not a cause of anything. Sidney had been worried about money and about his writing. The planners had piled up 5 rejections in England, and that hit not only at the bank account, but at the ego, which hit the bed department. He couldn't muster much passion or even affection for anyone if his ego was low. And one of his theories was that murderers had little or no sex life. Well, he wasn't a murderer, and he certainly had a sex drive and a sex life, but since he had been trying to imagine that he had killed Alicia, he'd had no stirrings toward her or anyone else. Not even toward Prissy Holloway. He had simply appreciated her, he felt. He thought of making a note about all this, then remembered the lost notebook. He went upstairs and looked around the bedroom, then in his study, even in the desk drawer where he used to keep it. He looked under the bed. Definitely he had lost it somewhere outside the house. He went into his study and made the note about Prissy and himself on a piece of paper which he put into the drawer. Then he went downstairs and opened his bag, which was still in the middle of the floor, and carried his 3 dirty shirts to the laundry basket in the corner of the junk room beyond the living room. It was 11:20 p.m., Saturday night. He got the London directory for the T's from the telephone table and tried Edward S. Tilbury of Sloane Street. No answer. He hadn't expected any, and yet it bothered him, that meaningful emptiness of the flat in Sloane Street. It was bound to be the right Tilbury, Sidney thought, because the other 3 Tilburys were a dentist, a resident of a Camden town street, and the Maida Vale dweller who hadn't answered when Sidney rang from Sumner Downs. It could be the Maida Vale Tilbury, but Sloane Street was more likely. Sidney felt as he listened to the futile rings in Sloane Street that he really loved Alicia, and maybe loved her all the more because he had taken her for granted, just as perhaps she had taken him for granted, and Sidney didn't mind that she had. He had taken it for granted that they loved each other despite their quarrels, and they still did love each other, he felt. He hung up. Maybe Alicia was thinking the same things he was at this minute. Maybe her happy face had been an act she put on for Tilbury, or to try to convince herself. But what were her intentions now, he wondered? To keep on hiding out until he got into a worse mess? Was that her way of getting back at him? And meanwhile, what should he do? Tell the police he had seen her, and where he had seen her? Should he tell them now, or 2 days from now, or in a week? Should he write to Mrs. Lehman's, Angmering, and tell her he knew all, and would she like to come back to him or not? He could write that he forgave her, if she'd forgive him, forgive his foul quarrelling and his practical jokes, and would she like to come back? Yes, he wanted her back, if she wanted him, and he could swallow his pride enough to ask her. Sidney was staring out the window, and suddenly the scene of unkempt lawn, picket fence mended by him, painted white by Alicia, the old croquet mallet poking out from below a bushy hedge, the maligned dustbin with its lid askew, seemed to writhe with a life of its own, like a Van Gogh landscape, and it was at once filled with Alicia and with her absence. Sidney decided to let the Alicia situation go for 24 hours, and if possible to solve the Polk Faraday dilemma. For 24 hours, he could imagine he had killed 2 people, Alicia and Mrs. Lillibanks, and imagine what the world thought of him or suspected. And after 24 hours, he would have wrung that idea dry of what it might furnish in the way of story material. Then he would decide what to do and act on it. If Alicia said she didn't want to come back to him, he could at least help her to start divorce proceedings, which he was sure she was too afraid to begin herself. He took some coffee up to his study and sat thinking. He tried to imagine Hitty's attitude. She ought to disapprove of Alex's stand, if Alex were honest enough to tell her what he'd said. On the other hand, one could never overestimate the loyalty of a wife, be her husband pimp, picklock, or priest married on the sly. Hitty might rationalize and join forces with Alex, or she might really believe, as Alex was pretending to believe, that he had done Alicia in, and Mrs. Lillibanks too, and might believe the whip stories would be interrupted or even never get started. The first show would be sometime in October, Plummer had told Sidney and Alex weeks ago, if the series was bought. The thing to do, Sidney supposed, was talk to a lawyer, or directly to Plummer. The situation didn't seem to be bothering Plummer now, and Sidney wished he'd had the wit to point that out to Alex in London. Alex giving him a deadline, an ultimatum. Of all the cheek, as Alex would say. Sidney got up from his desk and prepared for bed. The tranquillity of Sunday morning and the newspapers was broken by a telephone call from Inspector Brockway. He had heard from Brighton that Sidney was back, and he wanted to check with Sidney. "I heard you had a fruitless search," said the inspector. "I'm afraid so," said Sidney, a little amused by the word fruitless. "May I come by and see you for a few minutes sometime this afternoon?" the inspector asked. They agreed upon between 2:30 and 3. Sidney decided to serve tea, though it was early for tea. Tea would give a relaxed, domestic atmosphere to the unrelaxed and undomestic Bartleby household. Inspector Brockway, in flannel +4s and the blue and brown tweed jacket today, began pleasantly by congratulating Sidney on the sale of his whip series. "Thank you," Sidney said. "How did you hear about it?" "Your friend, Mr. Polk Faraday, rang me up. Friday morning, I think it was. Your collaborator, it seems." "He's sort of a playwright, yes. More than I am, anyway." "He was a little worried about whether you'd be able to continue with the series in case the situation worsens." Sidney looked at the inspector, who was rubbing his chin and staring at the floor as if he were talking of the weather worsening, of something incontrollable. "Well, has it worsened?" Sidney asked. "No, but it is out in the open now, you might say. Even though there's not something about your wife or you or Mrs. Lillibanks in the papers every day, not in all the papers, that is, the subject is not going to be dropped until your wife is found, dead or alive." "Haven't there been cases of people who successfully disappeared forever? We have a couple of famous ones in the States. Judge Crater, never found dead or alive." He heard the kettle prepare to shriek. "Yes, of course. We have them too. But in this case we may need simply closer investigation. Harder looking, if you like." They could use a bit of that, Sidney thought. The kettle's note was ascending. He jumped up. "Excuse me, Inspector. I thought you might like a cup of tea." "Thank you," said the inspector. He brought his hand up to his mouth and gave a crate-breaking cough. Sidney scalded the pot, measured the tea in teaspoons, just as Alicia would have done, except that there was no lemon to slice. He carried the tea in on a tray. After a proper interval, Sidney poured a cup for the inspector and himself. Sugar, milk. The inspector took both. "Your friend, Mr. Polk Faraday, implied, or rather said, that there were some things that worried him. Have you any idea what he means?" Sidney looked at the inspector and shrugged slightly. "No? If you think he means anything specific, I'd rather hear it from you than from him." Sidney rather doubted that. Why should he? "I don't know what he could know that I haven't told you. I mean about where my wife said she was going. It could be that she talked to Alex and said something else. Is that what he means?" "I don't know what he means," said Inspector Brockway, watching Sidney closely. Here Sidney permitted himself to register concern, nervousness. Or rather, he did register nervousness automatically, rattling his teaspoon in his saucer, sitting forward on the edge of the sofa. Did he say Alicia had said something to him? No, that he didn't. It was more like a situation, I gathered. The situation here at home before she disappeared. Sidney passed a hand across his forehead and reached for a cigarette. The Polk Faradays were frequent guests when your wife was here, I gather? Oh, once a month, something like that. Even when you and Mr. Polk Faraday were collaborating? Yes, we did a lot of that by post. Still do. But if he heard you make any threats toward your wife, or overheard any quarrels, it'd be better if you told me about them. Oh, come, Sidney thought. Not better at all. Possibly worse. The inspector wanted to compare his story with Alex's, that was all. I'm sure the Polk Faradays overheard a quarrel or two, Sidney said. There was one night, I remember, when Alicia dropped a glass and I shouted at her, pretty loudly. Did you ever strike your wife? Yes, Sidney said solemnly. Once or twice, but not severely. Did Polk Faraday ever see you strike her? No, at least I don't think so. I don't think we ever had any serious quarrels while the Polk Faradays were here. What do you mean by a serious quarrel? One in which I hit her, or one that goes on for a few days? Sidney gripped his hand with the cigarette with his other hand. His trembling was genuine, but he was not trembling because of what they were talking about. He was thinking of Alicia with Edward Tilbury. I wish you'd talk to me about what's worrying you, said the inspector in a kindly tone. Sidney absolutely couldn't have done that, and the thought almost made him smile. Naturally, I'm worried about what Polk Faraday might say to you. He wants the Whipped series. He asked me yesterday to agree to a 40-60% split in his favor, or else he'd tell some stories to the police, he said. Really? True stories? I don't know. I doubt it. What stories could he tell me that are true? I don't know, except a couple about quarrels I had with my wife. If he tells me anything, you may be sure I'll check it with you before I believe it or pass it on, Inspector Brockway promised, and set down his cup. There's one other matter which turned up while you were in Brighton. A notebook you left in the newspaper shop here in Ronsey Knoll. Sidney's start was practically a shudder, and his tea slopped into his saucer. It wasn't the notebook, but the place, and that suspicious proprietor. He remembered now, breaking a 10-bob note there the morning of the day before he left for Brighton. Sidney pushed his fingers, damp with tea, through his hair and said, Oh, yes, I wondered where I'd lost that. And the proprietor must have seen him not pick it up from a stack of newspapers, Sidney thought, and had decided not to call his attention to it because he wanted to have a look at it. Mr. Tucker said he would have returned it to you that day, but you weren't home. No, Sidney said, but he had been home that day, and left for Brighton the next day. It's not important. Just some notes. Notes for stories. The inspector smiled understandingly. Mr. Tucker thought it was a diary. Of course, it looks like a diary, with the dates in it. Sidney glanced at the pockets of the inspector's jacket. He didn't see the notebook. Notes for fiction, you say? Yes, imaginary. All of it, Sidney said, realizing once again that the truth sounded guilty as sin. Some sounds like fiction and some doesn't. However, considering you're a writer, it could all be fiction, I suppose. That's not the way the average person would take it, like Mr. Tucker. The account of the murder, pushing her down the stairs and all that. The inspector smiled quickly and pressed large, knuckly hands together. Yes. Well, as you probably gathered, I was trying to imagine all of it. Some of it, yes. Certainly sounds imaginary. Well, for safety's sake, we have the notebook at headquarters in Ipswich. No one has seen it but me up to now, except Mr. Tucker and his wife. Nevertheless, considering the nature of it, Mr. Bartleby, I'm afraid I must show it to Inspector Hill, who's coming down from London next week. The Sneezums have insisted on Scotland Yard looking in. Sidney grimaced and stood up. "May I pour you some more tea, Inspector?" he asked, reaching for the pot. "No, thank you very much. I must be off. Golf appointment at 4 o'clock over at Aldborough." He stood up also. "I'll say good afternoon, Mr. Bartleby, and thank you for the tea." "Good afternoon, Inspector." Sidney watched him walk along the short stretch of driveway to the road where his conservative black car stood, a bag of golf clubs visible in the back seat. Sidney closed his own door. An hour later, Inez called. "I had a hunch you'd be home. When did you get back?" "Last night. In answer to your first question, I had no luck," Sidney said, feeling he had to ward off the question. "Oh, Sid," she said sympathetically. "Well, my gosh, if the police can't find her and they got a whole platoon at work. You didn't happen to see Edward Tilbury?" Sidney laughed. "If I'd seen him, I'd have followed him. Because Carpy and I found out he's not home much lately, especially weekends." "Really? Tell me, is he the Tilbury in Sloane Street?" "Yes, I think so. I remember Vasily mentioning Sloane Street. Carpy and I didn't make a big point of it, but we asked a couple of people how he was, because we hadn't seen him in quite a while, and we heard he's away every weekend. He told Vasily he's visiting friends in Surrey or Sussex somewhere. It's like playing detective, you know?" Inez chuckled. "And as Sherlock Holmes would say, maybe it isn't logical to draw a conclusion just from this, but there's something you could do, Sid, if you're really interested, and that's trail him from his house one weekend. See what train he catches and maybe go with him. Or trail him from his office. They can't arrest you for trailing somebody." "No." Sidney hated the conversation. "Inez, if the police talk to you and Carpy again, I'd just as soon you wouldn't mention Tilbury. First of all, we don't know, and it isn't at all wise to, but they could find out if it's true. Easier than we could. It'd help you." "I realize that, but it's hard to explain over the telephone, and I don't mean to be telling you what to do, but—" Now he was almost in a sweat. "I'd just appreciate it if you say you still don't know any more than you did a month ago." Inez reluctantly promised, and a few seconds later their 3 minutes were up. Sidney went out for a walk. He walked toward the setting sun and wondered if Alicia and Tilbury were walking together on some beach now. Good Lord, he thought, they could have been together nearly 2 months now. That was long enough for them to get to know each other well. What on earth were Alicia's intentions? Why didn't she write to him and have it posted from London if she didn't want him to know where she was? Sidney had an almost overpowering desire to write to Mrs. Lehman's in Angmering and simply ask her what she wanted, let her know he could explode her game any time he chose. But he shrank from it with a feeling akin to the qualms he might have about invading someone's privacy. Pride was mixed up with it too, and now he didn't want Alicia to know her actions bothered him enough for him to ask her intentions. Alicia would go to pieces anyway if she knew the world knew about her lover. And the other thing that held him back was the fact that the situation was becoming more interesting because of its duration. He was curious, too, to know how far Alex Polk Faraday would dare to go. On Monday morning at 7:15, with a cigarette and a cup of coffee beside him, he rang the Sea Winds Hotel in Clacton-on-Sea. "Would you ring the Polk Faraday's room, please?" Hitty answered, sounding more sleepy than the operator. "Hitty, I'm sorry to wake you at this hour," Sidney said, and he really was. "But I wanted to be sure and catch you in. Could I speak to Alex?"
"Oh, yes, Sid. Just a minute. Wake up, darling. It's Sid."
Sidney heard Alex mumbling, then he came on. "Hello, Alex. I just wanted to tell you that I don't accept your 40-60 split. I accept a 50-50. Is that clear? You asked me to tell you today."
"Very well," Alex said more crisply. "We'll see about that."
"Have you told Hitty about the 40-60?
Alex didn't answer for a moment. "Sidney, I don't mean to be unfriendly, but I think you'd better do some serious thinking."
"That's all I wanted to say, Alex. Goodbye." Sidney hung up. So Alex didn't want to be unfriendly. That was a nice line, of course, for Hitty to hear. Sidney concluded that he hadn't told her of his plans. Sidney stood on tiptoe in the living room with his coffee cup and laughed out loud. The sun was already shining through the window, and it promised to be a lovely day. Moreover, the post a few minutes later brought a letter from Potter and Desh, the London publishers to whom Sidney had sent the planners 3 weeks ago. They would buy the book. Sidney felt redeemed. He stood holding his breath and staring at the short, typewritten note. "We are pleased. Could you come into our offices soon to discuss a few—" Our contract will be following after—" He walked to the junk room end of the house, then turned and walked back, in a daze, into the kitchen. He was smiling foolishly. He'd have a book out. And a good one. And he had no one to tell the news to. Or rather, no one he wanted to tell the news to. He wouldn't tell anyone, he thought, until someone asked. "Well, Sid, what's new these days? What are you working on?" Then he'd say casually, "I have a book called The Planners, out soon from Potter and Dash. It's a good book, or they seem to think so." And certain brilliant paragraphs and sentences went through his mind as he bathed and shaved. 25. Around 2 that afternoon, as Sidney was attacking the junk room with an objective of throwing away and tidying, Inspector Brockway rang up and asked if Sidney could come to Ipswich at 4. Well, it was the last thing Sidney wanted to do. "It's rather important, or I wouldn't ask you. Inspector Hill is coming down from London. Mr. Polk Faraday has spoken to him, so if you don't mind, Mr. Bartleby—" He set out at 3:15 in order not to antagonize Inspector Hill by being a bit late. He half expected to see Alex, who must have whisked himself to London that morning to speak to the higher-ups, and so might have come up with Hill to Ipswich, but Alex was not in view. Sidney was introduced to Inspector Hill, a tall, slender, handsome man in his late 40s. Inspector Brockway introduced them, looking stiff and serious, and on his best behaviour for London. The three of them went into an office that might have been borrowed for their conversation, or might have been Inspector Brockway's. Sidney could not tell, as Brockway did not choose to sit behind the desk. Inspector Hill began with a few minutes of relaxing comment on the difficulties of finding people who wanted to hide, and expressed disappointment that Sidney's 4-day search in Brighton had not been successful. Inspector Hill lit a cigarette, and so did Sidney. "Mr. Polk Faraday spoke to me this morning in London. He mentioned several things that I thought I should take up with you." Inspector Hill's tone was pleasant, and he gathered 3 or 4 small pages of notes together in one hand. "This carpet story," he began with a smile. "It seems the Polk Faradays visited you one weekend shortly after your wife left. Mrs. Polk Faraday noticed there was a new carpet in the living room, and they said— Rather, Mr. Polk Faraday said you reacted strangely when his wife mentioned it." "How strangely?" "You looked worried, according to Mr. Polk Faraday." "I don't know what they mean. I told them I bought the new one very cheaply and got rid of the old one." "Did you tell them how you got rid of it?" "No," Sidney said. "The next point. Mr. Polk Faraday says that you acted strangely on the telephone with him when he rang you from London one day after the weekend. You were talking about the way you'd gotten rid of your wife. Mr. Polk Faraday says you might have been joking, or maybe you weren't. Pushed her down the stairs, he said you said. Never felt better in my life." Inspector Hill smiled. Sidney did not smile. "Yes, I said that. Is Alex trying to make something serious out of it?" "We don't know. He's reporting it. And it's correct, is it?" "Yes," said Sidney. He had no doubt Inspector Hill had seen his notebook, probably in the last half hour, so it was very fresh in his mind. "He speaks also," Inspector Hill went on, and Sidney had the feeling he wanted to throw everything at him at once for a reaction, "of an atmosphere of hysterical gaiety about you. On that weekend. Bachelor life was agreeing with you and all that." That was Alex's comment. "You were talking about living on your wife's income, or that you soon would." Another remark of Alex's. "I joked about it later. We make up plots like this, you know. We're always making macabre jokes." Sidney's voice cracked on his last word. His palms, pressed together between his knees, were actually moist now. "I've done nothing about trying to get my wife's income. I'm not at all sure I could. I should think her parents could stop that." "No, they couldn't. Not the £50 a month part of it," said Inspector Hill. "If she were dead. They could, of course, not pass on to you what would have gone to Alicia once they're dead." Sidney drew on his cigarette. He glanced at Inspector Brockway, who was leaning against the desk, listening. "And," said Inspector Hill musingly, sitting very still in his chair with his legs crossed. "The Polk Faradays think you went out of your way to tell people that you didn't know when your wife would be back, and that it would be a very long time, 6 months or so." "I told people that when I was asked." "You didn't make a point of saying it?" "No. The Polk Faradays say you did." Sydney wondered if Hitty had come to London, and decided she hadn't because of the children. Alex had probably just been reporting what my wife and I think. "The Polk Faradays are wrong," said Sydney. "Another point." Inspector Hill looked at his notes. "Your friends Inez, Haggard, and Carpe Dunn. Mr. Polk Faraday seems to know them too. He says he spoke to them, and they described a Saturday afternoon in which they came to your house for a picnic. Your wife had then been gone about 3 weeks. According to Mr. Polk Faraday, you told them and everyone that your wife was at her mother's house in Kent, and that afternoon Mrs. Haggard told you that she had not been able to reach your wife at her mother's house. Her mother didn't know where she was, or even that she was away from home, and this took you by surprise. Or you were rattled." "Rattled? I was surprised, since my wife told me she was going to her mother's." Inspector Hill leaned back and watched Sydney. Sydney also leaned back and folded his arms. He saw a babbling, maniacal Alex, eyes bulging, yakking away at Inspector Hill in London that morning, but silent, like a television picture with the sound turned off. "Didn't Mr. Polk Faraday talk to you about the Whip series for Granada Television?" "No," said Inspector Hill. "Well, he should have. That's what all this is about. We've just had a series of 6 stories accepted, and Mr. Polk Faraday proposed a 40-60 split in his favour, instead of the 50-50 the contract calls for. I think, too, that Mr. Polk Faraday thinks if he can throw enough suspicion on me, he might squeeze me out entirely. I would have thought Inspector Brockway would have mentioned this to you." Sydney glanced at Inspector Brockway. "No, he didn't. Neither did Mr. Polk Faraday," said Inspector Hill. "Yes, I can see why you're piqued, but you tell me Mr. Polk Faraday's statements to me are essentially true, or do you not?" Sydney shifted in his chair. "They are exaggerated. The jokes. Alex reports them all as statements from me, it seems." Inspector Hill smiled and rubbed his chin. "I appreciate writers' fantasies. I've just seen your notebook, which I assume is a notebook of ideas, not truths." "Truths? Ideas?" Sydney passed a hand across his forehead. "The narrative, description in the notebook is not true. You might say the ideas in it are true. I mean, it's not a diary of facts. It's a dangerous kind of thing to write just now. For you. I had no idea anyone but me would see it. That's why I carried the notebook with me. I pulled it out by mistake with my wallet." A murderer's Freudian slip, Sydney supposed. He looked down at the floor. He was thirsty. "We'll take your word for it for the time being, but we must keep the notebook until this matter is cleared up," Inspector Hill said. "Now, if these things were said by you to Mr. Polk Faraday, and, by the way, did you say such things to anyone else?" "No. I only joked that way with Alex." "It was still a strange situation. Your wife leaving for such a long time, much longer than any of her previous trips. Isn't that true?" Did they expect him to break down, Sydney wondered, just by pointing out obvious facts? "Yes," said Sydney. "Did you kill her?" Sydney could practically read the question in Inspector Hill's calm eyes, and Sydney imagined his brain busy with the suspicions the Sneezums had put there. Meanwhile, Alicia was sleeping with Edward Tilbury. "Why don't you find her, if you think I killed her? Underground or overground?" Sydney said in a tone as calm as Inspector Hill's. "We are looking. It's not easy, as you see. Meanwhile, I'm exposed to attacks such as Polk Faraday's putting on. It's not easy for me, Inspector." "The attacks won't be in the newspapers, at least. That's not the way we do things here." Inspector Hill glanced at the motionless, attentive Inspector Brockway. "On the other hand, You could hardly do better at incriminating yourself, and I don't mean only the notebook, which, by the way, Mr. and Mrs. Sneesham don't know about. What about the binoculars? Your neighbour Mrs. Lillybanks told Inspector Brockway you reacted with what seemed to her extreme uneasiness when you saw the binoculars in her house, and when she told you she had seen you the morning you buried the carpet. But you've dug up the carpet. Answer the question, please, Mr. Bartleby. Why were you uneasy when Mrs. Lillybanks mentioned seeing you through the binoculars? Because I knew what she was imagining, thinking. Really? Inspector Hill asked earnestly. Why did you think Mrs. Lillybanks would think a thing like that? Well, I didn't at first. But when my wife didn't write to Mrs. Lillybanks, which Mrs. Lillybanks mentioned to me, I began to see what she was thinking. Inspector Hill said, and glanced at Brockway, who was still leaning quietly against the desk. Hill stood up. I have nothing more to ask at the moment, Mr. Bartleby, except, have you ever had any treatment for mental disorder? No. No breakdown, ever? No. Sidney stood up also. Alex had probably told them he was cracked, Sidney thought. Dear old Alex. I'd like to go back with you to your house for a few minutes, if you don't mind, said Inspector Hill. Of course Sidney didn't mind. We can go in one of our cars, said Inspector Brockway. Are you going home now? Sidney had thought to go by the library, but he obligingly said he was going home. I'll drive him, Inspector Brockway added. You won't have to lead the way. Sidney drove home at his usual rate of about 40 miles per hour. The inspectors arrived in Brockway's black car less than 5 minutes after Sidney. They came into the living room, and Inspector Hill looked around, at the staircase and at its top, as if measuring its lethal distance with his eyes. It was covered with a rather thick carpeting that would have been a help in any fall, or rather a hindrance for a murderer. They went upstairs, and Sidney showed them Alicia's painting room with its dried palette becoming dusty now, though Sidney hoovered and dusted the room like any other when he cleaned. They looked into the room where he worked, and into the bedroom. They went outside, and Inspector Brockway pointed out Mrs. Lillybanks' house from the front, and then they walked to the back of the house. Sidney had not been asked to come with them, so he stayed behind, and re-entered the house through the front door. Inspector Hill, of course, wanted to see how far the driveway and back door were from Mrs. Lillybanks' windows. Sidney looked out his workroom window and saw Inspector Hill gazing at the ground as he walked around the rectangle of the garden. He also went into the garage, opened the doors wide to let light in, and disappeared in the garage for several minutes. Then the two men stood between the garage and the garden, talking together for so long that Sidney stopped watching them and sat down at his desk. A milk bill had come that morning, so Sidney got out his cheque-book and wrote a cheque for £1, 3 shillings and 9pence to be put into an empty bottle tomorrow morning. When he heard the men come in through the back door, Sidney went down. Inspector Hill smiled at him and said, Thank you, Mr. Bartleby, for letting me look round. May I ask what your plans are about the house? You intend to stay on here? Yes, Sidney said. You don't find it lonely? A little, but I don't mind being alone, not as much as most people. He was annoyed with himself for his pleasant tone. He was talking to a man who had swallowed everything Alex had said. The inspectors left. It was after 6. Sidney got into his car and went to Roncy Knoll for the Evening Standard. Mrs. Hawkins was in the newspaper shop. But Sidney had decided to face them all for his paper and not drive 4 extra miles to Framlingham for it just to avoid Buttonlip. Mrs. Hawkins drew back deep among the candies at the far end of the shop, darting glances as if for support to the 2 other people who stood between her and Sidney, but they were musing over the long glass counter of sweets. Buttonlip rolled toward him, and Sidney got 4 pennies from his change, reached for the Evening Standard, and was surprised to see the old picture of himself, cut to just the head and shoulders, on the front page, 1 column wide. It was a picture of him in a white, open-collared shirt that Alicia had taken at her parents' house shortly after they came to England, and Sidney supposed the Sneeshams had given it to the press. "Good evening," Sidney said, semi-pleasantly, to Buttonlip, and got a sort of grunt in reply. He did not look at the paper until he was home. The write-up beneath the picture was extremely short and vague. "Mystery man? Authoritative sources said today that a close acquaintance of Sydney missing wife Bartleby has shed a good deal of light on the personality of the young American. No details were given, but Bartleby was reportedly called far out in every respect. Damn them all, Sydney thought, and it occurred to him that the mess could cross the ocean and spoil the planners as well as the whip. He tossed the newspaper down on the floor, where it sprawled with a faint plop. Alex had very likely said that he made up most of the whip plots, that he had to steer Bartleby's kinky, Alex would say, mind back onto the track time and time again in their plotting. Sydney went out to the garage with a sudden idea. He turned on the garage light and dumped a tall paper bag of waste paper onto the ground by the open garage doors. Fortunately, he hadn't burned any paper in nearly a month. Now he picked out certain used typewritten sheets, on the backs of which, folded once across, he invariably made his notes for whip synopses and for chapters in his books when he was writing. He found 14 such folded papers, all scribbled over in his small handwriting with diagrammatic outlines and numbered scenes. Of course, he had his synopses carbons in the house, but these papers were the real beginnings, and they were all his. He went into the house to sort them out and see what he had to go on, in case he had to fight. 26. Sydney found that he had the 3rd, 5th, and 6th whip stories notes, and they were very much the same in his scribbles as they were when the synopses had been typed out. Story number 4 had somehow got lost or thrown away in a different place, and Sydney didn't want to go through the sloppy dustbin on the chance it might be there. The notes for the first 2 stories, alas, were burned weeks ago. He paper-clipped his synopses notes and put them carefully away. On Tuesday, August 23rd, a note came from Cecil Plummer of Granada saying that under present circumstances the purchase of the Whip series would have to be postponed until the situation is clarified. The contract, Mr. Plummer said, would be reissued and redated. Sydney remembered it had borne Plummer's signature and a date when he saw it. The postponement was a financial blow. It could mean a couple of months' delay, Sydney supposed. No money from Granada until the contract was signed, and no money from anywhere until the end of September, when $300 would come in on his quarterly arrangement of his dead Uncle Herbert's legacy. Sydney wished he hadn't paid the £28 grocery bill in Framlingham last week, because the store was very nice about its credit. Sydney had paid it because he had felt sure of the Whip's money. Sydney picked up the telephone and rang Potter & Dash for an appointment to discuss the planners. A very pleasant female secretary spoke to him. "Miss Fremantle is free at 4 o'clock today. Could you come in?" Sydney said he could. The appointment made him feel better. Sydney bathed, shaved for the second time, and drove off to Ipswich to catch a train for London. The Potter & Dash offices were in New Cavendish Street, one flight up in a large old building, a bit threadbare but clean. He met Miss Fremantle, a bespectacled, slender woman of perhaps 45. The points she mentioned were ones Sydney might have stuck on, he thought, if he had been editing the planners for someone else. Fuzzy thinking in some of Ernesto's politics, ex-communist, now Trotskyite, and an anti-ex-lover speech by one of the women was a little heavy-handed and eloquent for her character. The work wouldn't take him long, not that he cared how long it would take. He signed the contract in Miss Fremantle's presence, having made sure there was nothing in it giving a percentage of any movie money to the publishers. There was nothing about movies in it. "We'd love to see your 2 earlier books that you mentioned in your letter," Miss Fremantle said. "Would that be possible?" Her telephone buzzed. "Of course, I can post them this week." Miss Fremantle answered her telephone, then told Sydney that Mr. Potter would like to meet him, and would he step into his office the second door to the left down the hall. Sydney bade adieu to Miss Fremantle in a glow, his manuscript under his arm. He knocked on Mr. Potter's door. Mr. Potter stood up to greet him, a big, dark-haired man with glasses. All went well for 2 minutes, until Mr. Potter said, "We definitely want your book, Mr. Bartleby, but I hope you'll understand that we can't publish until this matter of your wife is cleared up. I'm sorry about it, but I think you'll agree that a new book shouldn't be blighted by something quite extraneous like this." Sydney had a sensation of blushing, which flustered him all the more. He pressed down his pride and said, "But you do want the book. There's no question of your not publishing." Mr. Potter hesitated. "I have to admit there is." Sydney was not in such a glow when he walked out of the building. Despite the contract, he knew he would lose if he tried to force Potter and Desch to publish, say 6 months from now. And who would want to be on such a hostile footing with a publishing house, even if he should win his case? He got some shillings from a shop, found a call box, and rang the post office in Angmering, Sussex. "Hello?" Sidney said when a man's voice answered. "I'm calling to ask if the Lehmans if they still have an Angmering address." He knew the town was so small. Merely Angmering would reach Alicia if she were there. "Oh, the Lehmans? No. Just a minute." And in a leisurely manner, as if it weren't a trunk call, the postmaster absented himself from the telephone and returned a minute later. "They said they were going to Lancing." Sidney knew the town by name from his map. "Any street?" "Just Lancing." "Thank you very much," said Sidney. Then he caught the first train he could back to Ipswich and his car. At home he checked the spelling of Lancing on his map, then wrote a letter on his typewriter. Tuesday, August 23rd. Dear Alicia, for some time I have known where you are, and though I still consider it your affair and your privilege to hide yourself, I would appreciate it very much if you announced that you were still alive. Afterwards, if you wish, you may go into hiding again. Please believe that I bear no ill feelings against you and hope that you do not against me. I suggest that you go to your parents' house. You do not have to see me if you don't wish to, but your staying away is making it increasingly difficult for me to live and to work. With very best wishes and love, Sid. He reread the letter, put it into an envelope and sealed it. It was certainly mild enough, he thought. Threats would get him nowhere with Alicia, though on the train to Suffolk he had composed threatening and angry letters in his mind, letters that mentioned Edward Tilbury. He knew what was happening inside Alicia. She was ashamed of having shacked up with Mr. Tilbury, and was having more trouble facing her family than the world, probably. Yet it was impossible to imagine Alicia facing up to the police first, ringing them or dropping into a station and saying, "My name is Alicia Bartleby and here I am." Therefore Sidney had had to suggest that she break the news through her family. The family was still a sort of nest where she would be protected, unless, of course, she decided to go into a police station on Tilbury's arm. But Sidney doubted if Tilbury had the courage to do that. He didn't look the type. Sidney drove to Framlingham to post the letter because they had a later collection than Roncy Knoll, and he wanted her to get the letter tomorrow. The next morning there was a letter from Dreyfus, Scott and Company, Sidney's American agents, on the floor under the letter slot, and he opened it eagerly. It was from Jim Dreyfus, and said, "August 22nd, dear Sid, S&S seem quite interested in the planners. I like it too, need I say, a great improvement. But they are worried about the publicity you're getting here. Sharpshooting in one gossip column, that's the latest, and of course there was a lot of stuff in July when your wife disappeared. S&S want to wait before committing themselves, but I think we can clinch it after—" Sidney felt a little faint. He went into the kitchen and automatically started making coffee. And was Alicia opening her letter at this moment? Sidney hoped so. He wished, now that he had said, "If you don't go to your parents in the next 24 hours, dear, I'll have to come down and get you." But he hadn't said that, and he could easily imagine Alicia sitting in a blue funk for the next week. Sidney drank coffee, but couldn't prepare any breakfast. Inspector Brockway dropped in at 11 that morning. His message was that Sidney might be asked by Scotland Yard to come to London to answer a few more questions. "I gathered they might want you there for a few days," the inspector said. "They'd like to ask you some questions, along with Mr. Polk Faraday." Sidney had in his hand a letter to Jim Dreyfus, which he had just been going out to post, saying he was positive the whole affair would be cleared up within 3 days, though he could not tell Jim why just now. Sidney said, "I'm sorry, Inspector, but I don't care to go." The inspector smiled slightly. "If you don't, they'll come to see you. It's not a question of their taking you to London forcibly, but you can't avoid answering the questions they put to you. We're all of us bound to answer questions put to us by the police. That's reasonable, isn't it?" Sidney said he no longer knew what was reasonable and what wasn't, but he felt he would have to prod Alicia again. His letter hadn't been strong enough. "Yes, it's reasonable," Sidney said. "Have you had any news of any kind?" asked the inspector, glancing at the letter in Sidney's hand. "No, I'm sorry to say." When the inspector left, Sidney waited until his car had turned around and disappeared before he drove to Roncy Knoll and posted his letter to America. In the post office, indifferent now as to what Mrs. Naylor at the window might think, he composed the following telegram and handed it to her. "Please contact your parents by tomorrow, Thursday, or I shall have to come for you. Sid." In the afternoon, instead of an answering telegram from Alicia, or a joyous telephone call from her parents to say she was on the way to Kent, or a call from the police saying the same thing, there was a blast from Alex. A 2-page letter with as many underlinings as an epistle from Queen Victoria. "So now you've done it, old chum. Got the whip postponed, which as you know means out, rejected, corpsed, exactly as I foresaw. I mentioned to the police that your own wife had once spoken to me on the subject of your sanity, asked me if I thought you were a bit off. I think this is important. You're in no mental state, and haven't been in some time, to compose anything but maniacal, illogical farce. I've had to manoeuvre our plots back to common sense 1,000,000 times, if you recall, or melodrama spun out of thin air like a spider web. But you'll be caught in your own web, Sid, and you are now. For your own sake, I advise you to hang on to what shred of sanity you may still have and make a clean breast of things to the police. Plead insanity, it'll go easier for you. I believe that you did Alicia in, and that you have convinced yourself somehow now that you didn't, after cockily admitting it, even proclaiming it at first. But now you'd prefer to think it was all a dream, like something you made up for a story. Hitty agrees with me, so don't think she may be on your side, or that I've coerced her into being on mine. She simply feels as I do about you." Because life would be pretty hellish for her if she didn't, Sidney supposed. He only skimmed over the last page, a thunderous peroration about defending his work, by which Sidney gathered he would have to haul out those synopses notes, and his family, and about justice, the clean and normal mind, and the sanctity of law-abiding society. It had a strong sneesome flavour. Alicia had received the telegram by 1 or 2 in the afternoon. Certainly by 4, Sidney thought. Unless, of course, she had moved from Lancing or never been there. But the telephone did not ring Wednesday evening, and he at last went to bed in a rage of impatience and frustration that kept him from sleeping for hours. 27. On Monday afternoon, when Alicia read in the evening papers that a close acquaintance of Sidney's had called him more or less a psychopath, she became quite jittery, imagining Sidney's rage against Alex. She was sure the close acquaintance was Alex Polk Faraday. Up to now she had heard of Alex's comments via Vasily, who got them from Inez and Carpi and told them to Edward. But Alex's statements now were to the police and the press. Sidney must have gotten into a quarrel with Alex over their Whip series, Alicia thought. It was like Sidney to fly into a temper and ruin things when he was on the brink of succeeding. Then Wednesday, when Sidney's letter arrived, followed by his telegram a few hours later, Alicia got into a near panic. Sidney knew where she was, and even knew her name. He must also know that the man she was with was Edward Tilbury. He'd been spying, and of course doing a clever job of it. Alicia drank several scotches to steady herself, but she was in such a state by 3 p.m. she could neither sit nor stand still. She was alone, and had been alone since early Monday morning. She had the feeling now that Sidney would barge into the house at any moment and knock her senseless before he summoned the police. Around 4, she did the unprecedented and rang Edward in his London office. She had to wait a long time while they extricated him from a conference, and when Edward came to the telephone he was angry. "I had to ring you, Edward. I'm in a terrible state." "I'm very busy. Can I ring you back?" "Can you come down tonight? Will you? Something's happened, but I can't tell you about it over the phone." "All right. I don't know if I can make it before 9, Edward said grumpily, and hung up. Edward arrived at 5 minutes to 9. Alicia, hoping he would take the 7:30 train down from London, had been concentrating on the clock for the preceding hour, and when she at last heard his quick step on the stone walk, her relief was like an inward collapse. He tried the door, used his key, then looked surprised to see her huddled in the corner of the sofa. "Why didn't you let me in? What's the matter, Alicia?"
"Oh, nothing. Now that you're here," she answered and got up. "Fix you a drink."
She found herself unsteady from what she had drunk, more than 1/3 of a bottle of scotch, which had done her no good at all. Come now, what's up? Somebody say something to you?" Edward tossed down his briefcase and hat and followed her into the kitchen. Alicia was determined not to tell Edward she had heard from Sydney, no matter what he asked her. Just where she went from there, however, she didn't know. She had burned Sydney's letter and telegram.
"In a way,"
she said finally.
"I just got horribly nervous on the street today. I went out to buy something and I came back with nothing."
She splashed scotch into 2 glasses. "That's all right, dear. Did you see someone? Did a policeman speak to you?"
"No."
"Did you see someone you know?"
"No, none of that."
She handed him his glass, smiling. They sipped their drinks in silence for a few moments, standing. Edward studied her with a worried expression. She knew he was going to launch into another speech about her going home to her parents as soon as he'd drunk half his drink. Where did one go from there? When the speech came, she barely heard it. The same old argument, even the same old words. Alicia only knew that she had to have Edward with her, or she'd go under. Here or London or anywhere but with her.
"I'm not going back, so don't talk about it," she said finally, interrupting him, and with more force than she thought was left in her.
"But obviously you can't stand the strain, and neither can I, much longer."
"Would you go back with me to my parents?" she asked.
"No, that I can't do. It's not fitting. It's impossible." He lit a cigarette. "But I think I should start things moving by going back to London. You'll never make a move unless I do. I feel I should go back and stay there. And I should go now. I should go back tonight." He moved restlessly about the room.
"Oh, Edward, don't leave me," Alicia wailed with a start of tears.
He smiled and patted her shoulder. She was standing by the sofa. "Darling, I'll be waiting for you. You know that. Whatever we have to face, we'll face together. But don't make me run the risk of losing my position and finding it damned difficult to get another if I do." Edward spoke passionately now.
"Then stay here,"
she pleaded. "That I can't, darling. Forgive me, but I cannot. I must go." Hesitantly at first, then more purposefully, Edward began to gather his belongings, preparatory to packing his suitcase that was in the bedroom closet. And absurdly, it crossed Alicia's mind that she owed Edward £72, because he had paid all the bills, almost, since they had been together. She could easily repay him out of the £100 that would be at the bank in Ipswich by September 2nd. She remembered, only a month ago, when finances had been her most embarrassing problem. Now money seemed a triviality compared to the total wreckage around her. She lifted her glass and tried to drink it all down at once, almost succeeded, but choked on the last couple of inches. Edward came back into the room as she was bent over, coughing, and she turned and darted for the door. It was cool outside. She ran into the dusk, ran faster at the sound of Edward's voice behind her, calling her name.